Welcome to another episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a returning guest. We have Dr. David Brendel, who co-founded Strategy of Mind as a psychiatrist. He's a certified executive coach, leadership specialist, and philosophical counselor based in Boston. He has vast experience as an executive coach and leadership trainer across a wide variety of corporate settings. He's an expert in applying cognitive psychology and leadership techniques in executive coaching and corporate training programs. And David writes about his approach in frequent articles for the Harvard Business Review, Huffington Post, and other publications. His newest book, co-authored with Ryan Stelzer, is called Think, Talk, Create, Building Workplaces Fit for Humans. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you, and thank you for having me back.
Absolutely, man. And we were just talking about how great your first appearance was. So we are so excited to have you back. And so I want to start out with a quote and an excerpt from your book because, well, this was honestly one of the most fascinating aspects of the book. And I had a hunch that this was written by you, David. So, I mean, I'm going to ask, but I'm pretty sure it is because this is obviously pretty psychiatric in nature. So I'm going to read the excerpt, but then we'll talk about it. So this is on the section on frontal lobe. So I'm pretty sure David wrote this. So there's been a growing understanding over the last few decades that attention deficit disorder in adults is a biologically based condition, often but not always presenting initially in childhood, that degrades a person's sustained focus on tasks such as reading and completing projects. The lack of attentional control often manifests itself in impaired executive functions, planning, reasoning, problem solving, decision making, and cognitive flexibility. The disorder is often treatable with medications such as Ritalin, but it is not purely biological. Its severity is usually determined by the nature and difficulty of the task at hand, as well as by social cultural expectations. It becomes a clinical disorder when it gets in the way of social and occupational functioning, and the individual seeks psychiatric help to manage the troubling symptoms. So this is, and you kind of go into the story of Brad, which I definitely want to talk about. You write, Brad's mental focus and sustained attention to work tasks were strong, and there was no indication that he had diagnosable attention deficit disorder. But he suffered with a related and deeply problematic, though still unrecognized and unnamed, condition that we might label active inquiry deficit disorder. So this was so great because obviously I've never heard of active inquiry deficit disorder, but the philosopher in me was like, holy crap, this sounds amazing. So first of all, I guess the question is, was this your section of the book, which I'm going to assume is yes. And what is active inquiry deficit disorder? And obviously, in the case of Brad, how did it manifest in him, and how was it related to his inability to function as a good manager?
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. I can say overall, the book was very much a co-authored project with Ryan, but it is true, I'm a psychiatrist, and maybe luckily for him, he is not a psychiatrist. So I did author that section, but Ryan and I both have talked quite a lot about active inquiry. And so when you bring up the made-up term, active inquiry deficit disorder, which I don't think anyone had ever heard of, including yourself, because that was our own creation. If we're going to talk about active inquiry deficit disorder, well, it would make sense to start out by talking about what active inquiry is in the first place, and then look at what the deficit may be, which was certainly something Brad, who is a disguised client, but somebody we worked with, and typical of many people we work with. So let me start by saying something about active inquiry, and then talk about the deficit and how it might be corrected. Medication doesn't usually do the trick. So active inquiry, as we define it in the book, is a very well-defined, very self-disciplined methodology of asking open-ended questions. So active inquiry equals open-ended questions and some other facilitating statements in a conversation. Open-ended questions are questions that don't have an easy yes or no answer. So if you ask somebody at work, how's the project coming along? They can't appropriately answer yes or no. If you say, are you going to meet the deadline? I need it by 3. They could say yes or no. They may say something else, but the framing of the question is very different in active inquiry versus closed-ended questions. So Active inquiry really is the theme running throughout the book as a solution to many of the workplace and societal problems that we're all facing. So Brad really didn't have the skill of asking open-ended questions, and it had a deep impact on himself and the company. It was a tech company that he had co-founded many years ago and was very successful. It had grown to dozens of employees over the years from 3 co-founders.
Wow.
And Brad was somebody who got easily stressed and overwhelmed. He was incredibly technically adept. He was probably the smartest guy in the room from the tech standpoint. And he had developed the products and continued to. But when it came to projects and relating to colleagues or direct reports, he kind of barked orders. If he asked a question and somebody was saying something, you could tell just by looking at him, this was feedback from a lot of people that worked with him, you could see that he was just kind of waiting for them to finish talking so he could say what he already thought. So it was clear, and we all know that feeling when we're talking with somebody that they're just chomping at the bit to say what they want to say and are not taking in what we're saying. We're all vulnerable to it. I know I am at times. But when it rises to the level of what we saw with Brad, we might call it active inquiry deficit disorder. And it had a major impact on him. The workplace really became pretty toxic and hostile. People stopped inviting him to meetings because they were impossible to deal with. Or if he came to meetings, meetings were pretty overwhelming and stressful and unproductive because he was just telling people what to do. And then the real meeting would happen after the official meeting, and people, so there were a lot of workarounds. Exclude him, don't listen to him, meet separately, strategize, and kind of isolate him. The way you might seal off an infection. And he was like an abscess. The rest of the body is trying to protect itself and encapsulate and fight it off, but they couldn't fight it off. Abscesses are difficult to treat medically without being surgically drained. And that was ultimately what happened in the company with Brad. He was surgically drained by being pushed out of the company, allowed to resign, we might say. But he had to move on. And he was extraordinarily upset and angry. It was his baby. It was the company he had co-founded and grown to its success. But he was never able to pivot to being a true, well-related collaborator. So it was post hoc that he came for some coaching. He had actually reached out about a year or two before and never pursued the coaching. Maybe it would have helped save the job.
Mm-hmm.
He explored it. He obviously wasn't ready to do it, but he was ready afterwards. And he was a wonderful guy. I mean, he was a devoted family man, hard worker, highest level of work ethic, commitment. I mean, he was a good citizen, this guy. And it was just kind of sad. But so the coaching got started, and it was a little difficult to know how to help him develop active inquiry skills when he was no longer in a job. There wasn't great context yet. He was thinking about his next career step and prospectively how he might do better next time.
Oh, and then can I also ask a really quick question? Was he also resentful at this point too, or was he still resentful?
He was still resentful.
Okay.
But what often underlies that level of anger and resentment is sadness and vulnerability.
Right.
And it becomes a lot of like narcissistic bluster. But when you get to know the person well enough, what you really see is that they're kind of just emotionally falling apart, sad. Sometimes it's defensive against getting depressed.
Right.
You're angry, you may not be so depressed. So some of the sadness and recognition and self-awareness started kicking in when he stepped away from the job and did some of the coaching. That opened up the possibility of him saying, what can I do differently? That really didn't go well. And as much as I blame them, it's my situation to deal with. But it was a little unclear at first how to get traction to help him practice how to relate differently instead of telling people what to do, facilitating more collaborative conversations that might help people with their own self-discovery process and building their own sense of agency and commitment to doing the right thing. So one of the fascinating things that kind of came up in a somewhat offhanded way was that he was having some struggles with a teenage son. Smart, nice kid, but he'd fallen in with the wrong crowd. Maybe some substances. Brad was really concerned about him. And so we recognized, hey, here's maybe a situation where we can practice some of this, because you're trying to manage your son, so to speak. You really care about his success. You want him to be a hard worker. You want him to be productive and satisfied in his life, engaged in his life. You can't just go tell him what to do. Everybody knows that parents just can't go in and point a finger and say, stop smoking pot, stop hanging out with that group. You're not allowed to go out. It's kind of hard to say that to a 17-year-old. Right. They have ways to get out of the house and do whatever they want, really. So we actually took that as an opportunity to start practicing active inquiry. And so he would take long walks with his son instead of just yelling at him in the kitchen and storming out. We agreed, take some long walks with him, take him for a drive, go for a weekend somewhere, do something that your son is interested in. And in the flow of that, often in movement, take a drive, do an activity. He really started practicing asking questions. How's it going with your friends? How are they doing? So some of it got discussed in displacement. What's going on with your friends? What do they like doing? What do they like doing when you hang out? And it kind of took it away from being a direct, angry head-to-head between the two of them, and opened up a conversation. And for the first time, really, maybe in their father-son relationship, there was much more, just kind of sharing about what was actually really going on. And Brad even opened up about some of his own stuff with work. And his son made a very positive transformation as a result. They got closer, and he saw, his son actually was thinking. It turned out his son actually was worried about who he was talking about. It was actually very reassuring to Brad that he, when he saw that his son actually was having some of the same questions and concerns that he was. And this very much directly applies to the workplace. Most people at work want to do a good job. They are working hard. Their workload may be too high. They may not have the organizational skills, but they're actually trying to do well. So just like with Brad, it's usually much more effective, except with a tiny percentage of people who may be a bit, toxic or narcissistic or sociopathic in the workplace, a small percentage that don't want to do a good job or are purposely undermining things. Most people like to be asked, how's it going? What's on your mind? What are your concerns? What's getting in the way? How can I help? Who else can help? Would how can we, rethink the priorities and the timelines here? That usually leads to much more engagement. It certainly did with Brad and his son. And then as he transitioned into a new job, which was a much better fit for him, he was practicing those skills, and to this day, it continues to go much better. He had a soft landing in a new job with a different level of engagement. So he had active inquiry deficit disorder. It was treated with coaching and very rigorous self-discipline practice in both personal and professional settings of more open-ended and collaborative discussion.
Right. Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. I mean, probably from his son's perspective, he felt like, oh, my dad is actually investing in me, as opposed to ordering me around or asking me yes or no questions. He asked me open-ended questions so that I can invest and tell him more about myself. And it's great that he cares, and maybe we can have a conversation and move this forward.
Right. Yeah, and then how did you guys get to that point? Because I'm going to assume, and I think this is a decent assumption, that he was a perfectionist, right? And the way he saw it in his mind was that, oh, I'm great, and everything that I'm doing is great, and it's everybody else's problem. So how did you guys kind of, obviously with his kind of consent and his inclusion here, how did you guys break down that barrier? Because I mean, this is maybe not narcissistic personality disorder, but it is an aspect of narcissism and very hard to treat.
Yes, exactly. Now again, we think of narcissistic people as really toxic people,
Right.
and probably about 1 or 2% of them really are. And many of them are in prison. They have no remorse. They're actually psychopaths or sociopaths and criminals. He wasn't a criminal. And the vast majority of people with narcissistic tendencies aren't. They have some kind of underlying fear, vulnerability, or insecurity. One of the things that was interesting that turned out with him is he just biologically was not wired for a couple of different reasons. He just wasn't somebody who easily smiled. We do know some people, right, who are it just comes so naturally. They're so warm and engaged. Their eyes light up. They smile. He didn't have that kind of affect, and there were actually some identified reasons for that, which he eventually brought up and shared, that really go back to childhood and a medical condition that made it difficult. So it takes time, and it actually takes a coach not having active inquiry deficit disorder to just keep asking. You were so right. Sounds like you're the smartest person. You were the best software engineer. You were the hardest worker. Well, let's just stipulate that all of those things are true. But what went wrong? You weren't the highest performer when it comes to getting people to perceive you that way.
Right.
And that came through because there was I did 360 interviews, spoke to 6, 7, 8 people after he'd left the job. What happened? Mm-hmm. And some of the sentences are described in the chapter about what people said. He never listens. He already knows the right answer. You can tell he wants to cut you off to say what he thinks. He doesn't really have my best interests in mind. And one of the most devastating parts of the feedback, also mentioned in the chapter, was somebody said, the company's thriving since he left. Wow. So again, that was a huge narcissistic blow with the angry reaction at first, but then some of the sadness, and with some support of the coaching, and again, not accusations, trying to help him not be accusatory and hostile toward other people. I got to make sure I'm not doing that either, even when I'm giving him tough feedback. So the coach needs to be really direct and clear, but also soften it with, there's something you can do about this, and provide some hope. So it's not a linear process. It took weeks and months to get to some of that, but he did end up coming around to realizing that some of his own personal vulnerabilities were what was driving that, and he needed to develop some insight and change there. And the stuff with his son really made such a huge difference, because that was so palpable to him. The relationship had become so tense and unsatisfying to both of them, and it changed to something he never could have imagined.
And that's great. And to highlight the importance of active inquiry more, I'm not sure if you wrote this story about Raymond in the book, but if you did, would you mind sharing how his story is important as related to active inquiry in the workplace?
Raymond was the patient who committed suicide.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. We do show throughout the book that actually the active inquiry deficit disorder actually can make people vulnerable to literally killing themselves. And in even more frequent episodes, to have kind of a soul murder, just feeling totally disengaged and burned out in the workplace. Yeah, but the Raymonds story was remarkable. He was somebody who had sunk into a really severe major depression and was hospitalized with suicidal thinking and kind of a breakdown in his mental organization and even some psychosis. And long and short of it is he came in, he was psychiatric rating scales for depression were administered, and they give kind of a numerical score. One of them is called the Hamilton Depression Scale, HAM-D for short. And his score was very high, as is typical of hospitalized depressed patients. It was over 30. most of us have some depressive symptoms like, low energy, or I'm not sleeping as well as I want to, or my appetite is too much or too little, or I'm really down on myself. So most people score around a 3, 4, 5. None of us are completely free of that. But when it's in the 30s, that usually means people are in the hospital.
Mhm.
So they came to the hospital, was treated with antidepressant medication and also a supplemental medication for some of the disorganized psychotic thinking. And over the course of a couple of weeks, he got a lot better. His HAM-D score went down to the double digits. And so at that point, what happens? The treatment team says, wow, the medications really work great. Now we can discharge him. He can go home and, we'll get a prescription to keep taking some of the medicine and have an appointment with the therapist. That's the typical arc of a psychiatric hospital admission in 2021. Average length of stay is about a week and a half or 2. So he was very much within that typical range. So he leaves, and 3 days later, the treatment team learns that he committed suicide. So that led to a lot of soul searching, a process that's called Morbidity and Mortality Conference, where it's a peer review, where closed door, legally privileged, which means whatever's said or written down in that conference is not discoverable by a court. So there's no concerns about people being fired or malpractice suits. So it led to actually lots of open-ended questions about what the heck happened to Raymond.
Right.
He was really depressed. He got medication, then he wasn't depressed, and then he killed himself within a few days. Raymond's not here anymore. He wasn't there to ask exactly what happened, but it became pretty clear in the, post-mortem analysis, sometimes called a psychiatric autopsy, that the team didn't adequately probably ask him questions.
Right.
And so they just administered the rating scale. It was all numerical.
Right.
Quite possible that the medication may have given him more energy, which sounds good, but not if you're suicidal.
Right.
Then you actually have the energy to take an overdose or hang yourself or throw yourself off a bridge. You might be better off at that point being unable to get out of bed. That would be safer.
Right.
So sometimes we've seen this, that antidepressant medications activate people before their suicidal thinking or plans go away.
Mm-hmm.
And part of why he perked up also may have been that he came to a decision. Now he was relieved. He's not going to suffer anymore. It looked like he had a very specific plan. Again, that's another reasonable hypothesis, not a conclusion, because we, as I said, we can't confirm it for obvious reasons. But there's a reasonable chance. And sometimes people who have committed suicide, who have attempted suicide but not succeeded, will later say, yeah, the whole reason I perked up was because I made a decision to get the hell out of this life and I'll be relieved. So then he can go around smiling and high-fiving people as he leaves the hospital.
Right.
And he obviously did complete the suicide. So we talk in that chapter again about close-ended versus open-ended questions. So the close-ended question is very typical in psychiatric care. Are you suicidal? No. Feeling unsafe? No. Will you continue to take your medication? Yeah. We made an appointment for you with your therapist next Thursday. Will you go? Yes. Those are all closed-ended, yes, no. Other questions are things like, if you start feeling unsafe, who can you reach out to? What would be the warning signs to you that things are going downhill again, right? Can't answer that yes or no. It prompts conversation that may have been helpful to Raymond to kind of think through, well, actually I do have a few people I could call. So there's the generation of thinking,
Right,
that could have happened with Raymond by the questions. The other thing that can lead to is more information for the clinician. Who could you reach out to? Well, if there's no answer, maybe he shouldn't leave so soon.
Mm-hmm.
If there's an answer that kind of feels superficial, maybe he shouldn't leave so soon. If he's asked the question and he starts fidgeting and sweating or wants to leave the room, well, maybe that should be explored some more. Maybe he's not ready. So whether it's a verbal or nonverbal response, the open-ended question provides a lot more data that could be used clinically. So the chapter really, and it's not in any way intended to assign blame to any clinician, because all the clinicians were practicing within the medical standard of care these days. That's how it goes. Closed-ended questions, documentation, no suicidal or homicidal ideation, reports willingness to continue medication. Again, that's all you need to discharge somebody. There's no requirement for active inquiry.
Right, and asking questions like, where do you see yourself in a year from now, 5 years from now?
Yeah,
that generation of thinking.
Oh, and this reminds me. So we had a psychologist named Dr. Margaret Rutherford on the show last, I think it was not November, December. And so she wrote a book on perfectionism. And one of the best—
it's called Perfectly Hidden Depression.
Yeah, Perfectly Hidden Depression. So she told this really great story. I don't exactly remember the name of the, it wasn't the real name of the client anyway. So she told the story of this person so they went in for a psychiatric evaluation. And so it was the same thing. Like, you got the standard depression scale, and the questions were like, are you suicidal? Are you planning on committing suicide? No. And then a week later, this person had tried to attempt, and then so they were hospitalized. And so the psychiatrist actually comes to see this patient, and the psychiatrist asks, like, I don't understand, like, what went wrong? Like, you told me you weren't suicidal. And then so the client says to him, yeah, but you never asked the right question. And so the guy's like, okay, what's the right question? If I were suicidal, would I actually tell anybody? So because he was a perfectionist, when he came to see the doctor, the idea was like, I'm great, right? So the doctor's like, hey, how are you feeling? He's like, no, I'm good. Okay, are you depressed? A little bit of sadness, maybe a little bit of fatigue. So the point is, some people hide it, and if you don't ask questions about related to perfectionism, I mean, not necessarily as a syndrome, but as a particular whatever condition, if you don't ask questions related to perfectionism, then the idea is it's often hard to find those answers, because some people, if they believe that they have to present like in a perfect sort of way to you, obviously, it's a part of depression where the person often tries to hide it and hides how they're feeling in general. And so what they're going to do is they're just going to say, yeah, I'm fine. And then, kind of a week later or 2 weeks later, whatever it is, when that person does attempt, you're like scratching your head and you're wondering, I don't get it. But yeah, man, sometimes it's like, if you kind of sit with the person and you kind of explore a little deeper and ask them questions that, don't really necessarily fit those standard forms, you'll get a lot out of them and you'll be able to save a life.
I mean, there are so many important points embedded in that story you just described. Certainly one of them is that these types of open-ended questions don't come easily. They need to be planned at times. So that would be where a clinician or a clinical team might sit and think, what are the right questions here? It can't just be the rating form, and it can't just be, are you suicidal or not suicidal? So that's a really brilliant, kind of well-sculpted question. And with well-practiced clinicians, they may come naturally, but even with the most sophisticated, experienced psychiatrist or therapist, it does require some thinking and pre-planning about how to bring those questions into the interview. One of the other really important points here is that one of the tragic elements of that is that mental health clinicians are trained to ask those questions. They are compassionate and smart individuals who have thought about this stuff before. The vast majority of them are actually pretty good at it. But there's a systems problem here. They have too many patients. Right. There are too many requirements for documentation. They're constantly being bombarded with paperwork and all kinds of regulatory requirements.
Billing.
I know in my own experience, even many years ago, before it got as bad as it is now, I couldn't believe it. I would go in for like 10-hour shifts on an inpatient psychiatric unit. I'd have maybe 6 or 8 patients. And I realized that at least 90% of my time was not spent with the patients.
Yes.
I was filling out paperwork.
Yep.
I was looking at labs. I was going to unnecessary meetings.
Mm-hmm.
My forms weren't being filled out in a way that the insurance company could be billed at the highest level. Going back and revising things.
Yeah.
Utilization reviewers, as they are called, are constantly coming by. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. We can't bill for this. We can't bill for that.
Yeah.
Right.
So instead of going and talking with my patients some more and asking the open-ended questions, That's what I found myself doing. That has only gotten worse over the last number of decades and years, to the point that most mental health clinicians are, at best, really stressed by that stuff, and in worst case scenarios, really burnt out and cynical already about the job.
Yes.
So,
Oh my God.
systems problem. It shouldn't be blamed on the individual. In most cases, it's a systems failure.
I could tell Leon relates.
Oh my
All
God.
those
Yeah.
yeses.
Literally. Yeah. I remember, oh my God, last week I ended up having a conversation with a client that I was actually going to stop seeing because I couldn't figure out how to like bill his insurance. They ended up changing the way they do, the way that the system operates altogether. And so I was like, look, man, I'm really sorry, but I don't think I can take it anymore. But thankfully I figured it out. And then eventually we kind of talked it out and everything is fine. I'm still able to see him. But I was this, like literally this close to stopping treatment because I was like, I don't know how to build this anymore. So my trying to figure out the system was, first of all, I'm so stupid when it comes to insurance, so stupid. So I'm trying to figure it out, like these systems, and they keep updating them to the point where like there's no guide for it, or if there is, they'll send you some manual that you're not going to have the time to read. So nobody talks you through these things, and you're clicking on stuff and you're poking around on the website trying to figure out why direct deposit doesn't work, and like, you know, how they can maybe mail you checks instead, and then you have to call them, and then when you call them, you're on hold for like 20 minutes.
And then you need this form from the bank, which the bank doesn't have for some reason.
Yeah.
But then you speak to another person at the bank, and then they happen to have the form. And
Yeah, it's true story. True story.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, you know, it's so true, and I think, you know, every mental health clinician these days has run into that problem, and usually in really, really time-consuming and distressing ways. I often find myself left questioning: is the insurance company just totally disorganized and on the verge of incompetent, or are they purposely doing this to not have to provide services and save money? Because as soon as you create all this red tape and lead to the kind of situation you're dealing with, in some cases, the treatment actually does stop, or at least stops for a period of time. That's financially beneficial to their bottom line. It's morally bankrupt and probably not good for the long-term health of the insurance company because of the reputation damage that comes. And again, it's hard to suss out which it is, but it's somewhere on the spectrum from disorganized and incompetent to nefariously profit-driven.
Right. Okay, so this is a great segue into the quantitative mindset, right? Something that we started talking to Ryan about. So how is it that, okay, when you guys kind of come in, right, and you do your presentations and you have like these great workshops, right? Okay, how do you then do it? How do you shift the company's mindset from a purely quantitative one to saying like, hey, no, guys, we should actually start thinking about the future, because in the long run and overall, once you ruin your reputation, you're done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, sometimes we're doing that with individual leaders or executives to at least begin to ask the questions or have some insights about thinking more about long-term gains and, as you said, preserving reputation versus the immediate quarterly or monthly earnings report. There's tons of pressure to have those reports look good. So again, some of it's a systems problem in how corporate governance goes and how decision making is structured, and some of it is external pressures from shareholders and that type of thing. But whether it's with individuals or with groups, our workshops are again focused around open-ended questions. We don't know the company in depth, but what we can bring is a process of reflection and conversation to the company. So we may ask, again, in an individual or group setting, let's think and talk this through. What are the pros and cons of making all the decisions based on this bottom line versus coming across as serving the community in a way that might not optimize the bottom line this month, but positions you over the coming year or two to maybe win more business? How do you guys think about that? Right. Sometimes they're so busy and they're so stressed and they're so task oriented that they actually haven't stepped back and asked the question. Now, some of this may come into a strategic planning process, and we sometimes do it under the rubric of strategic planning, but we really prefer to do it under the rubric of coaching and leadership development, and not having it be as mechanistic, but more reflective. One of the stories we mentioned in a section that has to do with behavioral economics is the question of should stores, whether it's a small mom and pop shop or Home Depot, what do you do with the pricing of shovels during major snowstorms?
Right.
Now, if you go with the traditional microeconomics that was taught for decades, classic 20th century microeconomics focused on rational self-interest and supply and demand, it's kind of obvious. More people are going to need shovels, and we only have a limited number of shovels, so demand is up, supply is stagnant or down, raise the prices, right? Kind of obvious. I mean, that would be an easy answer on a multiple choice test for any student in an economics course. Well, it turns out many of these stores and companies have found what you should do is just the opposite. You should give the shovels away for free. Or at the very least, keep the price the same or reduce it a bit. Right. So why? The short-term profitability goes down. That might not mean as much to Home Depot as it means to the small mom and pop shop. But what does it breed? It breeds trust, community cohesion, engagement, likability. And these are the lessons of behavioral economics that people in an ongoing way, the way they make choices about spending, are not based on a rational microeconomics analysis. It's based on emotion. Right. And if you can breed positive emotion, you're likely 6 months, 6 years later to have that customer come back and maybe make a much bigger purchase. So we try to bring some of the lessons of behavioral economics, but we're not behavioral economists, and we're not coming and doing economics lectures for people. Right. We maybe in our presentations or in our coaching are giving these types of examples along the lines of the shovels that I just gave, but then saying, how does that work for your company? What might make sense? You're doing it a certain way. Where might you think of, if anywhere, that you could make that kind of shift to giving the shovels away for free and breeding more engagement, whether it's with your employees or your customers?
Right. I love that. And that reminds me of the Hume quote where he said something along the lines of like, reason is the slave of the passions, where the idea is that essentially we kind of make decisions more so based on our feelings rather than, our kind of the rational aspect of our mind, rather than, it's like what I think more so than anything that behavioral economics has taught us is that most people make emotional like business and, let's say financial decisions as opposed to more rational ones, where it's like they think of reason in terms of like, okay, how do we sort of set. It's not about goal setting, but how do we create a plan to meet the goals or let's say, fulfill the goals that we've set for ourselves. But the goals essentially are emotional. So it's like, take podcasting, for instance, right? We put in a lot of effort for the guests who put in for the effort for us, right? So it's like, if we have a guest on and that guest seems to really enjoy the show, let's say, they spread, the episodes around, they might comment and DM us and say, hey, thanks so much. I really enjoyed this episode. If we have them again next time, we're going to exponentially put in more effort for that guest than let's say maybe for either a newcomer or somebody that maybe sort of enjoyed the appearance, but not really. So there's like a kind of like a standard that we set. So if we really like a person, we're going to say to ourselves, okay, we're really going to put in the effort to promote their book, their documentary, whatever it is that they have going, whatever it is that they have out. And the reason is because emotionally speaking, there's this connection that makes us say, you know what, I have an obligation to this person because this person seems to sense that they have an obligation to me. And I feel like a lot of times when we're making business decisions, maybe not most of the time, but a lot of the time, it seems like we feel a debt to the business in terms of what they provide for the community that we have to kind of provide in turn for them.
Right. And that's not just the right thing to do, but in many situations, some of which we talk about in the book, the long-term financial consequences are much more positive. Right. It can enhance profitability. So we really wanted to be careful in this book to not say, we're not just here to lecture you on virtue or moral issues. We don't have the answer for your particular company, but there are enough examples from behavioral economics that it may be worth stopping, thinking, talking about whether this approach actually in addition to being the right thing to do, will be profitable.
Right.
Maybe not tomorrow or next month, but what about a year or 5 from now?
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's just thinking of the win-win,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to win-lose, like what's going to benefit me in the short term versus what benefits us in the long term.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And to be honest, man, Alan is like the king of active inquiry. I feel like everything that we do in terms of like, outside of our friendship, like professionally, he always tries to figure out like how both parties can benefit. And I always appreciated that about you, especially when it comes to conflict resolution. He's always about that.
Of course, you want to find out why it is that the person thinks or feels the way they do.
Right.
Right. Because you want to think that they're not different from you in the sense that, you want to relate to them. You want to understand where they're coming from so you could sort of come to some sort of resolution. I mean, I don't know. And it's especially in terms of friendship, it's not worth it to argue with a friend over either an imagined slight or even a real slight. It could be something that this is going to be a little bit of a visual, but let's say this is the slight, but this is the friendship, right? Then,
Right.
Maybe we can look past this and try to figure out what's going on to just, resolve that, because it's not worth it to lose a friendship, let's say over an argument,
Right.
for example.
Yeah.
And well, at the risk of sounding really Pollyanna about this, I might say, sometimes the slight or the argument can deepen the friendship, because it can show things like the friendship is resilient. Like, we're two different people. We have our emotions. Things can be misinterpreted, but when it actually is resolved, it shows both friends that, wow, this really does run deep. And I'm going to be more confident now that even if I misinterpret something or I do something that I didn't mean or intend because of whatever stress or distraction,
right,
it's okay. This will be fixed. So sometimes looking for those, you don't want to go around looking for slights or creating them, but they just come up naturally, and they can be recast as opportunities for deepening.
Yeah.
Oh, and I want to shift it a little bit.
Sure.
Have you noticed with your clients, there any concerns about COVID-19 as far as it relates to the workplace? I'll specify a little bit. Like, for example, right now, with more and more people getting the vaccine, many businesses are reverting back, going back from remote to working in person. Have any of your clients sort of discussed concerns they might have with their employees in terms of their comfort levels with returning to the office as it relates to mental health?
Definitely a frequent concern. And I've done some corporate presentations and written a couple of pieces on just that topic.
Yeah.
2020 was a scary time, but things were clearer, right? The marching orders were clear. Go home, don't leave your house. If you do, put on your mask, don't go anywhere near anybody, and you're not in the office. 2021, there are more encouraging signs. The numbers are down a bit, quite a bit in many parts of the country. We've got the vaccines. The economy is picking up. But there's much less clarity. Should we be back in the office or not? And that partly is about safety issues and also partly about quality of life. Companies that are too rigid about back to the office, in some cases, are losing employees.
Right.
And there's a worker shortage. So the concern is definitely coming a lot on both the employer and the employee side. So I'm seeing quite a bit of that. Like I said, I mean, last year it was really clear. Go home. Now it's, well, I don't know. Stay home, go back to the office, go in 2 days a week, go in when no one else is there, have part of the workforce there, and not have satellite offices. It's become much less clear, but that makes it even more ripe for active inquiry within companies. How are we going to do this? And we do encourage employers, bosses, managers, talk with your people. How are you going to be most productive? What works for you? How can we make sure that we hit all our benchmarks and grow the company while doing it safely and in an appealing way for you?
Right.
I've had people tell me that they're nervous about going back to the office, not because of catching the virus, But a couple of people said, I'm so nervous about going back to the office because there's no way I can be as productive there.
Mm-hmm.
When I've been home, I'm not commuting. I'm sleeping better. I'm less stressed. In fact, sometimes I even work into the evening. I'm home. It's not a big deal. I've been getting 11 or 12 hours worth of work done. I go back to the office, commuting, distractions, too many meetings again. I'm going to get half the amount of work done. I don't know how I'm going to get my deliverables in. So it's a very wide range of concerns. But again, we see the solution at least partly running through active inquiry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love that. And just to kind of touch on the active inquiry process a little bit more, going back to Brad's story, right? The thing that I really appreciate about the process in general is the fact that there's so much compassion in it. And so when I was reading about Brad and the questions that you would ask him, that actually made me think of an experience that I had when I was in graduate school. So I remember I had a conversation with my, so she was my faculty advisor and the person who ended up grading my, it's not a thesis. We had what's called a capstone paper, but it's pretty much the equivalent of a thesis in graduate school. So I remember I had a conversation with her. And so, I mean, David, you'll know this from, I'm assuming, your graduate studies, where you have to pretty much, you sit in the session and they tape it, and then you have a bunch of supervisors come in and talk to you and tell you everything that's wrong with the session. So we had to do mock sessions, I remember. And so we would have them, they were pretty much presented in front of the class, and different people would give you feedback. And so I remember she asked me, and she said, can you come see me in the office? Like, after this class, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. And I say, sure. So we come in, we sit down, and she's like, okay, so like, what did you think of the actual session, right? She's like, before I even say anything, like, what are your thoughts? And I said, okay, I know what you're going to already say because I saw it too. And I said, no empathy. She's like, yeah, no empathy. She's like, you literally, for that client, showed no empathy. And so what I appreciated about her method is, rather than just saying like, hey man, like, you might not be good at this, or this might not be for you. What she did was she said, look, intellectually you have it. She's like, we can talk about theory with you kind of all day. And I really appreciate that about you. She's like, you have a real craving and passion for the information and the knowledge and really deeply understanding people. And she's like, I love that. Right. However, she's like, emotionally, it's not there. And she's like, we haven't seen it over several sessions with you. So I'm just curious, and I think you'd want to know this too. Is this something that you think that you can see yourself doing in the long term? Right. So why I appreciated that so much was by telling me, giving it to me in a way that indicated, okay, here are your strengths and here's something that's an important weakness. I appreciated that so much, because instead of just criticizing me and saying, hey man, you probably aren't going to be good at this, you should look at other things, she said, no, you have half of what we're looking for in this program, but you're missing the other half, right? So what is it that you think is going on? And do you think it's something that you'd want to improve on? And that's exactly what I saw what I read rather, when you and Ryan spoke to Brad, where the idea was like, okay, if you're not the problem, right? If it's not so much that you're a bad leader or a bad manager, and hear these great qualities about you, right? What do you think is going on? What do you think can be better, right? Because obviously you kind of see that something is wrong too, because you're not working anymore, right? You've obviously, you've left this company for, X, Y, and Z reasons. And I really love that you kind of put it in you kind of put the ball in his court, and you said, look, I want to help you figure out why or what it is that went wrong and how to kind of get you over that hurdle.
It's tricky work because you don't want the person to feel shamed or,
right,
unduly criticized, but you're also trying to get them to change.
Yeah.
Sort of in kind of think about it in, dialectical behavior therapy, which is so popular these days for emotional dysregulation disorders like borderline personality. The dialectic is validation, but change.
Right.
So empathy, but also helping people see that they are also at least partially responsible for their condition and very responsible for their fate. And that is the balance of most good therapy and coaching, that dialectic. I had a similar thing when I was very early in my training in psychiatry. I was working in the emergency room for a few months, and I was very focused on knowing every single thing about psychiatric diagnosis, medication, hard work. And I did very well with it. I was very rigorous, and I was given that feedback by the director of the department. But the one thing that's always stuck with me that she said, she ran through all those positive things, and then she said, how would you feel about letting your personality leak a little?
Yeah.
Yes. She said, I can tell there's a really warm and fun person underneath that. How do you go about bringing that person into the workplace also? And I never forgot it. It really freed me up to say, I can be a hard worker and be knowledgeable, but I've got to bring who I am if I'm going to succeed in the work with my colleagues and with my patients.
Oh, that's so interesting. And so what happened? How was that sort of manifested in the future? How were you able to bring out parts of your personality?
I think I realized that I was having thoughts that, at least to me, were kind of funny.
Mhm.
I was able, part of how I dealt with it internally was to keep a bit of a sense of humor, or irony, or even, think about books or movies. Oh, this is just like what happened in this novel or that movie, and just kind of keep it a bit lighter within myself. That was a coping skill for me. But I realized I was never saying it. So
Right.
I always have to be so careful about how we joke these days. But I did start to find ways to bring commentary, or make a little quip, or just be kind of fun. Or, at a certain point in my career, I lived near great old classic donut shop, and I started every Friday bringing donuts for the
Mhm.
team, and it became kind of a thing. Um, and it was worth every dollar spent, because people would start requesting the donuts. So, can you bring me the, I really love the chocolate glaze. Can you put a couple of extra of those in? And I got to know people much more. A perfect example of behavioral economics. It cost me a bit of money every week to bring 30 donuts. But yeah, like I said, worth every penny. So I started to realize it's not just about me going into those rounds and being the smartest guy in the room.
Right.
It was the donuts that really solidified people helping me and committing to me. The nurses would help me out more. People would share more information about what was going on. It was more fun and it was more effective.
I love that. And do you find that with your patients more so than anything, they remember the way you treated them, as opposed to maybe, I don't know, some sort of theoretical understanding of their ailments?
Um, I think patients obviously want competence, and they want to be
Right.
prescribed the right medication and given the right diagnosis and all of that. So that's kind of a baseline expectation. But to your question, what they remember in my experience is something very different than that. They're not going to say, boy, thank you so much for realizing that I should take Zoloft instead of Celexa. That was really great.
Mhm.
I have one patient I just loved working with over many years, who we were talking about some situation where somebody was being really obsequious to him, just a brown noser, as we might say.
Mhm.
And I said, it sounds like he's a real sycophant. Now, this guy was going into English literature, but he didn't know the word. He's like, what the heck is a sycophant? I said, well, go read about it. It's all about figs. So he did that, and sycophant and figs became a big part of our interaction. So the next time we met, he came in with a bottle of fig jam for me. And then he and his father came in for a meeting, and they said, oh, how do you like the fig jam? I said, it was the worst thing I've ever tasted in my life.
Mhm.
But the whole relationship now that we've had got solidified around talking about sycophants and figs. He's done great. I mean, he was in the hospital. Now he's finishing graduate school, and doing great. But I'm very confident that if he were here and you asked him, what do you remember about working with Dr. Brendel? He'd say fig jam.
Right. Wow.
Mhm.
And then, so what happened with Brad, right? So, I mean, obviously now he's no longer with the company. And how did you guys, I mean, first of all, like, how did he move on and what did he move on to? And how did you guys get him there?
Well, yeah, he moved on to another job in in a related field, in a
Mhm.
smaller company that was very collaborative, where he really liked the people. They knew his reputation. They really liked him. With the
Mhm.
coaching, he went in a little more relaxed, and with the active inquiry skills. Uh, so that coaching engagement had ended maybe 2 or 3 years ago. in the course of writing the book, I reached out to him and I said, I just wanted to let you know, I really appreciated the work with you. I'm going to write a disguised version of your story. But I even though it'll be disguised, there'll be no risk to your privacy or confidentiality. I would feel best if you just read it over. Partly so there's a transparency about it, that you know that it's mostly based on you. And also because I want to know if I got it right and how it was written up. Was this true to your experience, or is this just a David Brendel fantasy about what coaching looks like? And really, much to my delight, he called me back a week or two later and said, that was really painful to read. He said, but it was all true. It was all really accurate. And you described it accurately. I hadn't thought about it for a while. It was painful to me to read, but it was also inspiring to see, where I had gotten, and things are continuing to go well. My son's doing well, and I really like my new job. Wow. So that was, those all coaching engagements don't go that way, right? No job, no profession leads to perfect outcomes all the time. But to me, I thought that one was worth including in the book because it was such a good outcome and really, really inspiring what he did.
Yeah. And another one of my favorite parts of the book, and we mentioned this with Ryan because I wasn't actually sure who wrote it, and he said that it was you. It was the story of the Islanders and how you look at the quantitative mindset, right? In terms of obviously, from a business model, and you look at it in terms of like how we can gain more profit in the future. Obviously, them moving to Brooklyn was a complete disaster. So that was really cool. And I guess I wanted to ask you not to go into the story too deeply, obviously, because we definitely touched on it with Ryan. But like, what was that experience like for you, like personally, for them to see them to move to Brooklyn? Because obviously you're like a lifetime Islanders fan.
Yes. I will acknowledge that of all the chapters that I worked on or wrote on my own, that was the most fun.
Yeah.
As I grew up on Long Island. I was born in 1967. In 1972, the Nassau Coliseum opened up and the Islanders moved in, and they were terrible. But they were the local team. When I was in high school, I would ride my bike over to the Coliseum. That's how close within the community it was. And then, of course, they had their glory years in the 80s. So my experience of the Islanders is very deeply emotionally tied to where I grew up, to my parents, to my friends, to the unbelievable excitement of the 4 Stanley Cups in a row, then the falling on hard times in later years, and then introducing my own kids to the Islanders. Took them to their first game with my father. So we had 3 generations in the Nassau Coliseum. It was very meaningful to me, and they kind of fell in love with hockey in general and with the Islanders in particular. So and then we went to a number of games between 2012 and 15, and when the Coliseum closed, at least one of my sons experienced it on the same level of like sadness and tragedy that I did. I was astonished by that. And it was a great bonding experience for us. And then the whole journey of the team and the vagabond nature of it and the ups and the downs over the last 6 years, culminating now and then moving into a new arena. First game next week, which I'm planning to go to, in the new place, the UBS Arena. It's very deeply tied for me to family narrative, emotion, connection with my father, and connection with my sons. And from the behavioral economics standpoint, that's why I spend too much money going to Islanders games.
Right, which is so seemingly irrational.
It's completely irrational. I live in Boston. It involves a 4-hour drive to get down there, and I love going down to I love New York. And my father passed away a couple of years ago, but my mom is still there in the house I grew up in. And so we love going down for many different reasons, mainly family, Islanders, and we also have a Yankees connection. But the Yankees story has been told in so many ways over so long. The Islanders story has not been told in the same way, and that was why I wanted to bring that out in the book.
Yeah, I loved it, man. You inspired me to write an article on why why I love the Tampa Bay Bucks. So literally almost the same exact and yeah, for people who know, the Bucks were like losers for years, like way before I was born, right? From 1976 to 1979, they barely even won a game. And then like out of nowhere, right, they kind of go to the NFC Championship and they end up losing to the Rams in 1979. And then all throughout the 80s and 90s, they're horrible. And like their fan base has to be loyal, because in order to like put up with that terrible team, you literally have to be a loyal fan. Like there's just no other way to do it. Now it's easy because Tom Brady is there, so it's easy to be there. But back in like from the 80s to 90s, and then from 2003 to about 2020, they were awful. We had one playoff appearance with a playoff loss, which I was there for. But yeah, you have to be really loyal. And then you have this owner going back to the Islanders who's thinking, oh yeah, if we go to Brooklyn, we're going to get these business types who are honestly pretty selfish. They're going to want to buy seats and care? No, they're going to probably be there every once in a while for business meetings. They're not going to care about the actual team. And especially if we're talking about like fan participation and noise and affecting the game, those people aren't going to want to do that.
No. I mean, if the Islanders are going to be profitable, it's going to be the middle class working people out on Long Island, not the corporate titans in Manhattan. That's not the team ultimately will succeed. And they've figured that out, it seems, by moving from Brooklyn now back to Nassau County, right on the border of Queens. Like I said, the end of the chapter ends by talking the Islanders are moving back home to Long Island, but right on the geographic and spiritual edge of New York City. And that really is a great representation of what behavioral economics are all about. The emotion is out on Long Island. The team is just a couple hundred yards into Nassau County, and right across the Cross Island Parkway is Queens in New York City, and the financing, where the money is. And for business to succeed and be satisfying, you've got to make money for sure. But if you want to make the money, you better remember who cares about spending it.
Exactly.
I love that. I love that so much. And definitely, I think probably my favorite story of the book. So.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Well, personally, mine as well.
Yeah.
So, and the Buck, I hadn't thought of that though. The Buck story is a really great one, and the growth of Tampa Bay as a city.
Yeah.
And now it's, probably the best sports city in the country, with all between the Lightning and the Rays and the Bucks, of course. Boston had that status for a while.
Yeah.
It's moved to Tampa, so it must be very exciting for you.
Well, yeah, definitely, especially in terms of the Bucks. I mean, I don't follow, as far as like baseball, I'm more of a Yankee fan, even though I'm kind of like a casual fan. I haven't been really into baseball for years. But yeah, as far as the Bucks go, I mean, look, it's cool for the city just to have all three, I mean, the Rays technically never won a championship. Yeah, it's cool. But like, as far as the Bucks, honestly, man, after the championship in 2003, I never thought in my lifetime they'd ever get back to the Super Bowl, let alone win one. And the Tom Brady situation, the fact that they got him, just super improbable. I could have never envisioned that we'd have Tom Brady as our quarterback.
I had a massive bet. I think it was 25,000 to 1 odds with my son that Tom Brady would end his career with the Cincinnati Bengals.
Wow. Why'd you pick them?
I think because I tried to think of a team that is the most kind of obscure and hasn't won for all these years, but the Bucks would have been a decent choice also because of the as you described, the years of suffering.
Yeah, and then also with Tom, I mean, like he went to the perfect situation because they already had a great offensive line. They had terrific wide receivers, maybe the best trio in the league, and their defense was up and coming. So with Brady, he actually wanted to go to San Francisco, which like now has finally come out. San Francisco would have been a terrible situation for him. Not only are they like completely injury plagued, which I mean, totally you couldn't predict that back then, but on top of that, they don't have the type of weapons that Tampa had for him. So it was literally like a fucking miracle that, you had these two situations merge where you have this quarterback who's looking for a team, and then you have the team who's literally just looking for a good quarterback.
Yeah, and it sounds like the family is happy with the weather in Florida.
Yeah,
maybe more than it would have been in the Bay Area.
Yeah. All right. So, Alan, any final questions for David before we wrap up?
Yes. If we wanted to follow your work, where could we find you?
So a couple of different possibilities. One is the Strategy of Mind website, strategyofmind.com. I'm on Twitter at Dr. David Brendel. I think those would be the two main ones to go with, and then from there are links to to other relevant websites, including my psychiatry website and executive coaching.
I love that.
Awesome.
So, and just to tell you, I mean, honestly, Think, Talk, Create was probably one of my top 3 favorite books of the year. So I'm really happy you guys wrote it.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It was quite a journey writing it. Happy it's out there, and great to know that it caught your attention. And I really appreciate the invitation to come back. It's always great to talk to you guys.
Absolutely, man. Thank you so much, and good luck to your Islanders.
Good luck to the Bucks next year.
Thank you so much, man. Yeah. We're good. We're 6-2. So yeah. Playoff run is in the works.
I know. I can't. We're already well into football season.
I hear you. Well, thanks so much, David.
Okay,
Talk to you soon.
again.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay, that was awesome.
That was so fun.
All right, guys, if you want to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. And guys, again, thanks for watching, and see you next time.